In the heart of medieval Europe, a strange fear haunted the minds of both peasants and nobles alike. Not of witches, not of wolves, but of the dead themselves returning. Not as spirits, not as ghosts, but as physical bodies clawing their way back from the grave. These were not the flesh-eating zombies we know from modern movies. Medieval zombies were known by names like revenants, nachtzeres, or shroud-eaters. They were dead people who returned, it was believed, to torment the living, and they didn't rise because of infection or magic, but because of unfinished business, improper burials, or curses. Sometimes, it was even said that people who were simply too wicked in life couldn't rest in death. In England, France, Germany, and Eastern Europe, stories about these walking corpses began to surface in local chronicles, folk tales, and even church records as early as the 12th century. Chroniclers of the time treated some of these tales with complete seriousness. One English monk, William of Newburgh, described several cases of the dead rising again in the 1100s. He didn't laugh them off. He investigated. He even tried to make sense of them using religious and moral explanations. In his writings, revenants were not just creepy oddities. They were signs of a world out of balance. People genuinely believed that the dead could return if their sins went unpunished, or if their families had failed to mourn them properly. In some versions, these undead would creep around their old villages, spreading sickness or whispering curses at night. Livestock would die, crops would rot, babies would fall ill. To the villagers, the answer wasn't superstition, it was the restless dead. But what could be done to stop them? Here's where things get truly disturbing. Communities across Europe developed rituals to prevent the dead from returning. These weren't symbolic actions. They were very real, very physical, and sometimes very gruesome. One method involved digging up the suspected corpse and mutilating the body. The heart might be cut out and burned. The head might be removed and placed between the legs. Sometimes the body would be pinned to the ground with a large stone or iron spike, trapping the corpse in its grave. In medieval Poland, archaeologists have found burials with sickles placed across the throat of the dead. Presumably so, if the corpse tried to rise, it would decapitate itself. Others were buried face down or weighed down with stones to stop their return. These weren't one-off cases. The fear of revenants was widespread and consistent across many regions. In German folklore, there's the Nachzehrer, believed to cause death in the family, just by chewing its burial shroud. People were so afraid of this, they began stuffing the mouths of corpses with bricks or stones to keep them from chewing even in death. And yet, this fear wasn't always tied to evil. Sometimes the returning dead were thought to be misunderstood or lost souls. A medieval Icelandic saga tells of a shepherd who returned from the grave because his mistress never fulfilled her promise to bury him properly. When his bones were finally relocated with care, he stopped haunting the farm. The Catholic Church had a complicated relationship with these beliefs. Officially, the Church condemned superstitions about the dead returning, but in practice, local priests often participated in the banishment rituals, blessing graves, leading exorcisms, or even approving the destruction of suspected revenants. It was a delicate balance, to acknowledge the fear without encouraging heresy. Modern historians and archaeologists have tried to explain these stories in rational terms. Some suggest that diseases like rabies or ergot poisoning from mouldy bread might have triggered hallucinations and panic. Others point to premature burial, when someone thought to be dead suddenly moved again inside a coffin. But whatever the reason, the fear itself was very real, and it shaped how people dealt with death for centuries. These weren't just tales to scare children. They were community responses to death, grief, and guilt. They were ways to make sense of suffering in a time before modern medicine, and they reveal a world where the line between life and death was never quite secure. In medieval Europe, the grave was not always the end, and that was perhaps the most terrifying truth of all. The fear of the dead rising didn't stay in whispered legends. Across medieval Europe, entire communities developed practical, even bureaucratic ways to deal with the threat of the undead. These weren't just religious gestures or funeral rites. They were acts of social defense, taken as seriously as locking the village gate at night. In the small town of Berwick, England in the 1100s, a man died and was buried, but villagers soon began hearing noises near his grave. Livestock died. people grew ill. Whispers spread that he had returned. The townspeople did what many others had done before. They dug him up and burned his body. Chroniclers like William of Newburgh and Walter Map documented such events with disturbing matter-of-factness. These weren't stories meant to entertain. They were treated as community records. This fear wasn't limited to isolated villages. It shaped burial customs across the continent. In parts of Eastern Europe, particularly Poland and the Czech lands, archaeologists have found dozens of so-called anti-vampire graves. Bodies buried with rocks in their mouths, stakes driven through their chests, or heavy objects placed atop them. In some cases, the legs were removed or bound to prevent the dead from walking. But why did so many people believe the dead would return? In part, it was about more than fear. It was about accountability. The dead were believed to carry unresolved sins, secrets, or curses. If someone died suddenly, or if they had quarrelled with their neighbours, or even if their burial was rushed or incomplete, it created unease. A corpse that hadn't been mourned properly could bring misfortune. A burial done without a priest's blessing might open the door for a revenant's return. And then there was the idea of contagion, not just of disease, but of spiritual unrest. If one person returned from the grave, it was thought others might follow. Stories from medieval Germany tell of entire families being struck down one by one until the corpse responsible was uncovered and destroyed. In some versions, simply seeing or hearing the revenant could cause death or madness. This led to highly ritualized practices for preventing such horrors. In some parts of England and Wales, people would sprinkle poppy seeds or millet in the grave. The belief was that the undead would be compelled to count every seed before they could rise, an echo of similar beliefs found in Asia and the Middle East. Other communities tied knots in the burial shroud, hoping to delay the corpse long enough to ensure it stayed in the ground. These practices weren't just folklore, they were enforced at the community level. Local priests often played a central role. While church doctrine didn't officially support belief in physical revenants, it tolerated many local practices. Priests might bless the grave again, perform exorcisms, or even give permission to exhume the body. In one recorded case, a priest ordered a corpse to be burned because of the harm it was believed to be causing. And there was also a legal dimension. Some regions developed rules for dealing with suspected revenants. In 14th century Saxony, legal codes mentioned the destruction of corpses believed to be spreading death. These laws often framed such acts not as murder or desecration, but as protection, like destroying a dangerous animal or removing a cursed object. The law in these cases recognized the fear and tried to channel it into regulated action. While many revenant legends were about vengeance, some were tied to unfinished tasks. A man who died with unpaid debts might return to demand repayment. A woman who was murdered might rise until her killer confessed. These stories gave communities a way to explain the unexplainable and to pressure the living to do right by the dead. And perhaps most curiously, some tales portray the revenant as confused, not evil. In parts of Scandinavia, legends speak of corpses rising because they didn't realize they were dead. When spoken to, or gently turned in their graves, they would finally rest. It wasn't always fear that motivated the living, but guilt or sorrow or a deep belief in proper closure. By the late Middle Ages, these traditions had begun to fade, pushed aside by a more centralized religion, growing skepticism and better understanding of disease. But the fear never truly disappeared. It evolved. Stories of vampires, ghouls, and the walking dead would rise again in later centuries, transformed by time, but rooted in these early, desperate efforts to control the unknown. The people of medieval Europe weren't fools. They knew that the dead should stay buried, but when they didn't, the community acted, not with superstition alone, but with tools, rituals, and laws, because in their world, death was not a boundary. It was a fragile seal that could break at any moment. In the medieval world, fear of the undead was not just a problem for villagers and peasants. Even the church, perhaps especially the church, was deeply involved in addressing these terrors. When sightings of revenants became too common or too disturbing, the responsibility often fell not on warriors but on priests. These were not mere superstitions, at least not in the minds of the people at the time. They were threats to both body and soul, and the church had centuries of rituals developed to confront evil spirits, demons, and other entities considered unnatural. As revenants, or what we might today call medieval zombies, were believed to be animated by dark forces or the devil himself. Their presence was treated as a matter of spiritual warfare. Church records from the 12th and 13th centuries describe events where clergy were summoned to lay to rest wandering corpses. These actions often involved complex rites. In some regions, exorcisms were performed not on living people but on the dead. Graves were sprinkled with holy water. Psalms were read aloud over burial sites. In extreme cases, the body was disinterred, blessed again, and then reburied with additional safeguards, such as encasing the coffin in stone or placing a crucifix inside. This was no fringe practice. Ecclesiastical authorities took it seriously. For example, the Synod of York in 1195 issued a decree that prohibited clergy from leaving the city during times of reported corpse disturbances, unless it was to conduct the proper rites. Fear of the walking dead was not limited to folk tales. It had made its way into official church policy. But these responses were more than just spiritual. There were social consequences for communities where the dead were said to walk. Villagers lived in fear not only of the revenants, but of divine punishment. If a corpse walked, it must mean something had gone wrong. The person had lived sinfully, or the community had failed in its religious duties. These episodes often triggered waves of confession, church attendance, and even donations, as people tried to cleanse themselves in their towns of guilt and impurity. Interestingly, there was also a belief that some people were born with the potential to rise again. Children born with a caul, a membrane over their face, were feared to be marked and might return from the grave if they were not baptized properly or buried with care. In places like medieval Poland, archaeologists have uncovered graves where the deceased's mouth was filled with a rock or a coin, a practice believed to keep them from chewing their way back to the surface. These were likely victims of plague, social outcasts, or people accused of magic. Once dead, they were still feared. In response to such terrors, church rituals weren't always enough. In several chronicles, the clergy partnered with local leaders to organize what we might call cleansing hunts. These were not witch hunts per se, but rather community-wide efforts to find suspected walking corpses or those who had been possessed by undeath. Bodies were dug up and examined. If suspicious signs were found, blood around the mouth, uncorrupted skin, or open eyes, the body might be destroyed. Burning was considered one of the few guaranteed ways to prevent the return of the undead. It's easy to see how much this reveals about the intersection of religion and fear. The undead weren't just scary, they were theologically threatening. They challenged the church's control over death and resurrection. If the body could rise in an unholy form, what did that say about divine judgment? Were these souls denied heaven? Were they victims of satanic influence, or merely unrested spirits demanding justice? Some scholars believe that the rise in reported revenant sightings coincided with periods of religious turmoil. The 12th and 13th centuries saw significant upheaval in how the church viewed salvation, penance, and the afterlife. Ideas about purgatory were still being debated. For ordinary people, death was no longer a clear-cut passage to heaven or hell. That uncertainty may have bred a growing fear that souls could linger, lost, confused, and dangerous. In literature from the period, these ideas were explored more symbolically. Revenants were sometimes used as cautionary figures, appearing to warn the living against pride, heresy, or broken oaths. In these tales, the church was the only force that could banish or purify the dead, reinforcing its authority in both life and death. So, while the modern concept of zombies tends to lean toward the physical, rotting corpses, viral outbreaks, and horror, medieval revenants were more spiritual in nature. They were symbols of guilt, unfinished business, and spiritual imbalance. The clergy, with incense and psalms in hand, stood as the last defense against that eerie knock at midnight. The dead come back for more. In the fading embers of the Middle Ages, belief in the undead hadn't vanished. It had simply evolved. What began as grave-bound revenants transformed into cautionary tales, moral warnings, and whispers passed down in folk tales. But even as reason began to shape Europe's worldview, strange tales of the undead refused to die. As the Renaissance dawned, more people questioned old superstitions, yet paradoxically, this didn't eliminate the fear of walking corpses. Instead, these fears found new outlets, especially in rural traditions. In the forests of Eastern Europe, stories circulated about vampiric revenants. These weren't the glamorous vampires of modern fiction. They were bloated, ruddy-faced corpses seen feeding on the living, often believed to be neighbours or relatives recently buried. Communities still took extreme measures. In what is now Romania and Bulgaria, grave exhumations occurred well into the 18th century. Villagers staked suspected corpses, removed hearts, and even burned the remains. The rituals were deeply rooted in local tradition. They weren't carried out by madmen, but by grieving communities desperate to stop the invisible spread of illness or unexplained deaths. Even with growing literacy and medical understanding, science had no answers for outbreaks or mass hysteria. The plague, tuberculosis, and other wasting diseases made it seem like the dead were somehow reaching out to claim the living. When entire families died in succession, folklore filled the silence that medicine could not yet explain. In parts of rural Ireland and Scotland, there were tales of the restless dead who returned not just to haunt, but to enforce justice. These spirits weren't evil. They were wronged, denied burial rites, or cursed due to societal shame. Their return was often seen as a sign that the living had failed in their duties to the dead. Graves were reopened, bodies repositioned, and rites reperformed to soothe the spirit and the village. Meanwhile, Christian doctrine was evolving. The Church began folding many folkloric beliefs into teachings about sin, purgatory, and repentance. Instead of banning belief in revenants, clergy often reframed them as divine warnings. If a corpse refused to stay buried, perhaps it was a sign from God. This duality between ancient fear and religious interpretation helped undead stories survive even into the Age of Enlightenment. Interestingly, these tales weren't just kept alive by peasants or the uneducated. Some chroniclers and noblemen documented supposed encounters with the undead. In 1656, in what is now Croatia, a priest named Georgius Richtmann wrote of a woman who rose from her grave and caused illness in her family until she was exhumed and ritually dispatched. These were not anonymous myths. They were accounts given names, dates, and locations. As printing became more widespread, so did stories of the undead. Chapbooks, cheaply printed booklets sold across Europe, began to compile these eerie tales. Some were moral lessons, warning about greed, envy, or broken promises. Others read more like early horror fiction. But even these were often taken seriously, with authors swearing to their truth. By the 18th century, the idea of the undead had become entangled with early medical curiosity. Autopsies on exhumed bodies led to strange discoveries: fluid in the lungs, undecomposed organs, or blood at the mouth. Without modern understanding of decay, such signs were easily misinterpreted as signs of life. Thus, a medical anomaly could reinforce old superstitions. The Enlightenment brought skepticism, but it also introduced scientific obsession with life and death. Scholars wondered aloud about the boundary between the two. Could someone appear dead and later revive? Were cataleptic states misunderstood as death? These questions mirrored in a strange way the fears of earlier centuries, the dread that the grave wasn't the final resting place after all. By the 19th century, literature took over where folklore left off. The undead moved from rural legend to Gothic fiction. Bram Stoker's Dracula, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and countless other stories drew on centuries of whispered fears. The medieval revenant, once dug from the ground by terrified villagers, had now become a symbol of deeper fears: guilt, mortality, science without ethics, and the past that won't stay buried. But even today, echoes of these medieval beliefs linger. From zombie movies to vampire lore, the core idea remains hauntingly familiar: the dead may not rest, and the living may not escape them. The medieval world gave us more than castles and knights. It gave us a lingering fear that behind death lies not peace, but return. And while science has explained away the bloated corpses and sleep paralysis that once terrified entire towns, the stories remain. Because deep down, we still wonder, what if something truly can come back from the grave? In the chill of early modern Europe, a strange and deadly paranoia gripped entire nations. Between the 15th and 18th centuries, thousands of people, mostly women, were executed for witchcraft. Villages built gallows, courts held trials, and communities turned against their own neighbours. But beneath the religious dogma, social tension, and political control, another force may have fueled this mass hysteria: the weather. Between roughly 1300 and 1850, much of the Northern Hemisphere experienced a dramatic cooling event known as the Little Ice Age. Temperatures dropped by as much as 2 degrees Celsius in some regions, and winters grew longer, harsher, and more unpredictable. Crops failed, rivers froze, livestock died in the fields, famines became common, and with each failed harvest, the fear of something unnatural taking root began to grow. At first glance, it seems odd to connect cold weather with witch trials. But to people in early modern Europe, weather wasn't just an environmental issue, it was a divine message. Storms, frost, hail, or drought were often seen as signs of God's displeasure, or worse, as evidence of sorcery. People didn't understand meteorology, but they understood suffering, and when the world turned against them, they searched desperately for someone to blame. In many parts of Europe, especially in the German-speaking regions, witch panics surged in waves. These often aligned with periods of intense climate stress. For example, the late 1500s and early 1600s, when the Little Ice Age hit particularly hard, saw some of the worst witch hunts in history. In 1587, for instance, the town of Trier in Germany executed over 300 people in just a few years. The charges? Causing hailstorms, ruining crops, and cursing vineyards. These were not abstract accusations. The link between weather and witchcraft was seen as concrete and punishable by death. It wasn't just Germany. In Switzerland, Scotland, and parts of France, local records show that spikes in witch trials often followed crop failures or livestock epidemics. When the land gave nothing, fear and superstition filled the gap. People believed that witches could conjure storms, call down lightning, or withhold the rains. In a world with no scientific framework for climate change, the idea of someone cursing the weather made sense, terrifying, but logical. And these fears weren't limited to isolated communities. Religious and secular leaders fueled the narrative. Church sermons blamed moral decay for divine punishment. Political leaders found convenient scapegoats in accused witches, using public executions to demonstrate control during times of chaos. Manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum, written in the late 15th century, offered step-by-step instructions on identifying and prosecuting witches. It became a bestseller in an age when fear was the one thing always in supply. Women, especially older, widowed or outspoken women, were disproportionately targeted. Many lived on the margins of society. If their neighbours' cattle died, if a child became ill, or if a sudden storm ruined the village's grain, suspicion could fall on them. Often all it took was a whisper, a grudge, or a simple misfortune for an accusation to spiral into trial, torture, and execution. What's striking is how directly these accusations tied witches to climate control. Testimonies recorded during trials frequently mention weather magic, people confessing, often under torture, to flying through storms, raising tempests, or destroying crops with a glance. These stories seem fantastical today, but at the time they served as an explanation for real, lived trauma. When bread was scarce and winter bit harder each year, someone had to be responsible. The Little Ice Age didn't just affect Europe. It was a global phenomenon, but in Europe it collided with existing fears about sin, heresy, and the supernatural. This fusion turned ordinary climate hardship into a supernatural crisis. As people froze and starved, they didn't just suffer, they hunted. They sought witches because witches could be seen, named, punished. Weather couldn't. This obsession with blaming individuals for natural disasters reveals something deeply human. In times of crisis, we search for patterns, stories, and enemies. The weather became a mystery, and witches became the solution. This wasn't just superstition, it was a coping mechanism. But the consequences were deadly. Tens of thousands died. Entire communities were torn apart. And while today we may understand the cooling temperatures as a product of solar cycles, volcanic eruptions and atmospheric changes, people in the 16th century had no such framework. They only knew that the world was colder, crueler, and more uncertain than before, and someone had to pay for it. The winters grew harsher. Crops failed more often. The sky itself seemed to turn against the people. In this increasingly unstable world, it wasn't just nature being blamed, it was neighbours. As the Little Ice Age intensified, so did paranoia. Communities, especially those dependent on fragile harvests and tightly knit social bonds, began searching for someone to blame. And often, the easiest scapegoats were women, particularly older, poor, or socially marginalised women who lived on the edges of villages. Widowhood, herbal knowledge, or simply being seen as strange could be enough. In the minds of many, witchcraft explained the unexplainable. If hail ruined the barley, or a late frost killed the apple blossoms, then surely it was someone's doing. People began to fear not just the cold or famine, but each other. During this time, weather became moralized. Storms weren't just bad luck, they were punishment or sabotage. In German-speaking regions, entire villages watched the skies with dread. Theologians and judges wrote that witches could summon fog or hail to destroy crops. Clergy linked sin with natural disaster. If your town suffered a flood, perhaps you hadn't prayed hard enough. Or worse, perhaps someone nearby was actively consorting with dark forces. In Switzerland and parts of France, trial records show people being accused specifically of controlling the weather. One man was hanged for allegedly summoning hail that ruined vineyards. In Scotland, women were tortured until they confessed to raising storms that wrecked fishing boats. These weren't isolated beliefs. They were common fears, reinforced by folklore, church teachings, and the undeniable suffering caused by the climate. The courts began taking weather witch accusations seriously. Manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum encouraged interrogators to press for confessions. Torture chambers filled with people pleading their innocence or saying anything to make the pain stop. If a harvest failed, trials followed. If cattle died in winter, accusations flew. It was a dark feedback loop. Environmental misery fueled suspicion, and suspicion bred more persecution. But it wasn't just rural villages. Even cities weren't immune. In 1626, a group of women in Würzburg, Germany, were accused of calling down snow in mid-spring. Over 900 people were executed in the Würzburg trials over a few years. The city's bishop had become convinced that witches were behind not just the weather, but disease, fire, and plague. His fears and the cold reality outside created a storm of blood. Historians today point to spikes in witch trials that correlate with particularly brutal winters. Between 1560 and 1660, one of the coldest stretches of the Little Ice Age, Europe saw its deadliest waves of executions. While witch hunts had existed before, they had never reached such terrifying scale. The cold made everything worse. It tightened food supplies, spread hunger, weakened immune systems, and frayed already stressed communities. People needed explanations. They needed hope that rooting out evil could restore balance. Tragically, this meant that individuals, mostly women, became symbols of disorder and targets for violence. In England, the fear of witchcraft was tied to sudden misfortunes. A storm might be seen as the result of a neighbour's curse. Some pamphlets from the time even illustrated witches riding on clouds or dancing in thunder. These weren't just superstitions, they were frameworks for understanding the chaos people saw around them. But interestingly, not all regions responded the same way. Some areas of Europe, even those affected by the same cold, had fewer witch trials. This suggests that local culture, religious teaching, and political structures shaped how people reacted to crisis. In places where central authority was weak or where belief in magic was deeply embedded, persecutions flared most intensely. The climate didn't cause witch hunts on its own, but it amplified the conditions that made them possible. Economic instability, social tensions, and religious zeal all collided with a colder, harder world. The story of the Little Ice Age and the witch trials is a chilling example of how environmental shifts can influence human behavior. Fear, once planted, grows quickly in frozen ground, and once it takes root, it rarely stays rational. These were not simply cases of misunderstanding, they were systematic, deadly responses to real hardship, tragically misdirected. It's a reminder that in times of crisis, people often seek not just answers, but enemies. The fear of witches wasn't just emotional, it was institutional. In many places, governments and churches funded the pursuit of suspected witches. In colder regions hit hardest by crop failures, leaders believed that rooting out witches would restore prosperity. The logic was chilling. If someone had cursed the weather, eliminating them might bring back the sun. In Germany, this belief turned deadly efficient. Towns kept records not just of trials, but of weather patterns alongside executions. In Bamberg, the Prince-Bishop ordered the arrest of dozens when a cold snap destroyed the harvest. One of his own councillors was accused after protesting the killings. The logic of fear spared no one. Witch hunters and inquisitors gained power. Some even made careers of it. They travelled town to town, offering their expertise in identifying witches, often for a fee. Their methods were brutal. Suspects were thrown into rivers to see if they would float. They were stripped and searched for witches' marks, small blemishes or moles said to be the devil's touch. Confessions, often extracted under torture, confirmed people's worst suspicions. Victims told stories of flying to Sabbaths, summoning storms or poisoning livestock, anything to end the pain. And those confessions, printed and shared across Europe, fueled more panic. If one woman in a village could call hail from the sky, maybe others could too. Communities became gripped by suspicion. Children accused parents. Neighbours turned against neighbours. Sometimes entire families were wiped out. The colder the climate, the more vicious the hunt. In Norway, Finland, and parts of Russia, weather-related accusations were common. In Iceland, one man was burned after being blamed for a series of shipwrecks caused by freak storms. But behind the trials was always one core belief, that humans had somehow caused nature's wrath. In an age before modern science, this made sense. People couldn't explain the jet stream or sunspot cycles. What they saw were ice-covered fields, flooded roads, and dying cattle. The weather felt personal, and someone had to be responsible. Churches also played a major role. While early Christianity had often dismissed witchcraft as superstition, by the 15th and 16th centuries that changed. Religious reformations had shaken Europe, and both Protestant and Catholic leaders began using witchcraft as proof of the devil's influence. Sermons warned that sin could invite destruction. Books and pamphlets described witches as agents of Satan, actively working to ruin God's creation. In this worldview, weather wasn't just natural, it was spiritual. Rain and sun were blessings, drought or frost were punishments. If God was angry, perhaps a hidden witch had drawn his wrath. So communities acted, violently, publicly, and with grim certainty. It's easy to view this history as a relic of the past, but the way fear spread, the way climate anxiety turned into persecution, still echoes today. People under pressure look for patterns even when none exist. They search for villains instead of causes, and when desperation grows, logic often shrinks. What makes the Little Ice Age so pivotal is how it turned normal struggles into extraordinary terror. People had always faced bad harvests or harsh winters, but during this colder century the failures piled up. The margin for survival shrank, and as people reached for explanations, they found them in old myths, dark fears, and deadly accusations. Even as the scientific revolution was dawning, belief in weather magic held strong. Isaac Newton was exploring the laws of motion, but in villages across Europe, farmers still blamed their misfortune on witches. Enlightenment ideas hadn't yet reached the rural poor, and in cold, hungry homes, old stories made more sense than invisible climate cycles. What's haunting is that many of the people accused were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. A healer whose herbs failed to cure an illness, a lonely widow with no family to defend her, a traveller caught in a storm near a struggling village. The climate didn't just change the environment, it reshaped how people saw each other. By the late 17th century, the worst of the witch hunts began to fade. Courts grew skeptical. Some leaders realized the trials weren't solving anything, just sowing more fear. But by then, tens of thousands had been killed. Most were women, many were poor. All were caught in a storm far beyond their control. As the worst of the hunts died down, a slow shift began across Europe. The connection between climate and persecution wasn't broken overnight, but the winds were changing, literally and figuratively. Some regions began to experience milder years, and with that, the intensity of fear loosened its grip. In cities where Enlightenment thinking was taking root, scholars started asking new questions. What if the cold was natural? What if no one was to blame? But that realization came too late for tens of thousands of lives already lost. The social trauma ran deep. Many communities never fully recovered from the terror they inflicted on themselves. Some towns were left with gaping absences, mothers, daughters, and neighbors who had vanished. Fields once tilled by accused witches sat barren, a quiet reminder of how fear had turned inward. The link between climate and scapegoating didn't disappear. It evolved. During other environmental crises, droughts, floods, epidemics, new targets emerged. In the 19th century, during famines and plagues, minority groups were blamed. People whispered of conspiracies, poisons, and curses. Though the age of witch trials had ended, the instinct remained. When the world seems broken, find someone to hold responsible. Historians today still debate just how tightly the Little Ice Age was tied to the witch craze. Some argue the correlation is clear, cold spikes matched peaks in accusations. Others caution against oversimplifying. But the data is compelling. In periods of harsh weather, executions soared. When the weather stabilized, they declined. It's not proof of causation, but it is a pattern. This history forces us to confront a deeper truth. Climate affects not just our crops, but our minds, our stories, and our choices. When temperatures fall and resources vanish, societies behave differently. They tighten ranks, they grow suspicious, they act on fear. And if the past is any guide, those decisions can be deadly. Today we face a different climate crisis, not a mini ice age, but a warming world. The parallels are unsettling. Already we see the rise of scapegoating during floods, wildfires and droughts. Misinformation spreads, people point fingers, conspiracies bloom in the shadows of fear, and though we no longer burn witches, the instinct to blame still burns hot. But history doesn't have to repeat. It can also warn. Understanding how past societies responded to environmental stress can help us do better. We know now that bad weather isn't magic, it's measurable. We have science, satellites, and forecasts. But we also have something else: choice. We can choose to respond with reason instead of panic, with compassion instead of punishment. Some modern historians and climate scientists are using the Little Ice Age as a case study, not just in weather patterns, but in human behavior. How do people act when their survival feels threatened? How do belief systems twist to explain the unexplainable? And what happens when fear spreads faster than facts? The answers aren't always comforting, but they are valuable. The witch hunts remind us that knowledge alone isn't always enough. Even in times of discovery and progress, old fears can return in new forms. The past whispers warnings, if we're willing to listen. There's another layer to this story that often gets missed. The accused, those branded as witches, weren't just victims. Many were community healers, midwives, or herbalists. They held knowledge passed down for generations. Knowledge about plants, weather signs, and how to survive harsh seasons. Ironically, in killing them, some villagers silenced the very wisdom that might have helped them adapt. That tragic irony still echoes. In the face of environmental change, we need knowledge, especially local, practical, lived knowledge. Listening matters. So does resisting the pull to blame. The climate isn't a judgment, it's a system, and when it shifts, we must ask, how will we shift with it? As we look back at the icy decades of the Little Ice Age and the burning fires of the witch trials, we're reminded of something haunting and true. The cold can freeze crops, but fear can freeze hearts. In some ways, the second danger is harder to escape. The weather changed Europe, But it was the human response that turned cold seasons into hot terror. It wasn't the frost that caused the witch hunts, it was the fear that followed. And that fear, if left unchecked, can still spark fires, even in a world getting warmer. London in the 1300s, a bustling, grimy city of trade and turmoil. Merchants shouted across markets, ships lined the Thames, and in 1348, something terrible arrived, the Black Death. Within months, tens of thousands were dead. But centuries later, something unexpected surfaced from beneath the layers of death. In 1986, archaeologists began excavating a burial site in East Smithfield, just outside the old city walls. It was one of the earliest mass graves from the Black Death. But when scientists studied the remains, they uncovered something shocking. Many of the people buried there weren't of local English descent at all. DNA analysis revealed a surprising fact. Medieval London wasn't just white, English, or isolated. Of 41 individuals studied, nearly a third had ancestry from outside Europe. Some showed African heritage, others traced their roots to the Middle East or Southern Europe. One woman, in particular, had clear markers of African origin, but grew up in Britain, based on isotopes in her teeth. Another individual seemed to have spent his childhood in North Africa, before settling in England. These weren't slaves or curiosities, they were regular people, labourers, wives, children, who lived, worked, and eventually died in one of the most dangerous pandemics in human history. Their presence tells a bigger story, one that rewrites the image many people have of medieval London. In schoolbooks, the Middle Ages are often painted as grey and isolated. England is shown as a monoculture, inward-looking, cut off from the outside world. But this isn't the full truth. London, even in the 14th century, was a global city in miniature. Why were people from Africa and the Middle East living in medieval London? The answer lies in trade. London's position on the Thames made it a magnet for merchants and travellers. Goods flowed in from the Mediterranean, the Baltic, and the Islamic world. And where goods travelled, so did people. Seafarers, soldiers, diplomats, and traders from distant lands arrived with silks, spices, and stories, and some of them stayed. Even during the chaos of the Black Death, these communities remained part of the city's fabric. The East Smithfield burial site showed no signs of segregation. People of different backgrounds were buried together. That suggests these individuals were integrated into everyday life, not outsiders, but Londoners. The Black Death killed indiscriminately, rich and poor, local and foreign. But in death, these forgotten Londoners left behind a powerful message. Their bones whisper a story that the written records overlooked. A story of migration, mingling, and hidden diversity. What makes this discovery so important is that it challenges long-held assumptions. For centuries, historians believed that pre-modern England was ethnically homogenous. And it's true, many chroniclers didn't note race or background unless it was unusual. That silence led to the assumption that diversity didn't exist. But now, science fills in the gaps. Isotopes in teeth reveal where someone drank water as a child. DNA shows their ancestral origin. Together, these tools uncover the hidden threads of London's medieval population. Imagine one of these individuals, perhaps a young woman born in Africa, raised in Bristol, buried during the plague. We may never know her name, her language, or her faith, but we know she existed. She walked London's narrow streets, breathed its smoky air, and became part of its story. Modern London is one of the most diverse cities on Earth, but its multicultural roots run deeper than most realise. The idea that London was always white until modern immigration isn't just wrong, it erases real people who lived and died centuries ago. Archaeologists are now asking new questions. If people of African and Middle Eastern descent lived in 1300s London, where did they live? What work did they do? Did they face discrimination? Were there communities, or were they scattered across the city? The evidence is growing, but much is still unknown. What is certain is this. Global diversity is not a modern invention. It's part of London's DNA, quite literally. In the following parts, we'll explore how London's global connections deepened through trade, religion, and diplomacy. We'll meet African trumpeters at royal tournaments, Dutch weavers in working-class districts, and foreign ambassadors navigating English courts. We'll also examine moments of tension when fear, jealousy, and unrest targeted those seen as outsiders. But it all begins here, in a graveyard, not with royalty, nor knights, nor castles, but with ordinary people whose bones rewrote history. Walk through the medieval streets of London, and you might not expect to meet someone from North Africa, the Middle East, or even Central Asia. But peel back the cobblestones of time and a more complex picture emerges, one that speaks of unexpected links, forgotten travellers, and lives woven into the city's fabric from faraway places. Let's begin with a discovery in a small graveyard near the Tower of London. In 2013, archaeologists uncovered a medieval burial site. Among the bones was a man who lived in the 13th or 14th century. Tests revealed he grew up in North Africa, probably Morocco or Algeria, and lived out his final days in London. There was no indication he was a slave or servant. This man might have been a sailor, merchant, or scholar. The fact that he lived and died in London suggests a society that, while not free of prejudice, had more room for outsiders than we often assume. London's position as a bustling port city meant it welcomed people from all over. Documents from the 14th century show traders from the Mediterranean, especially from Italy, Spain, and the Levant, doing business in the city. Some even settled down. These people brought goods like spices, cloth, and ideas that reshaped how Londoners thought, ate, and traded. One such group was the Genoese. These were merchants from what's now northern Italy. They arrived with silver, wine, and wool, but they also brought with them knowledge, mathematics, medicine, and seafaring skills that Londoners were eager to learn. Genoese families are recorded buying property in London and even lending money to English nobles. Their names often vanished into the English-speaking crowd after a generation, but their influence lingered. We also find traces of Jewish communities who were expelled from England in 1290, but had been present in London for over 2 centuries prior. Before that expulsion, Jewish doctors, moneylenders, and scholars played key roles in the city's life. Though often forced into specific roles and subject to heavy taxes and persecution, Jewish Londoners left behind letters, legal records, and stone inscriptions that tell us about the rhythm of their days. After their return in the 17th century, they re-established roots in London, but their earlier medieval presence is only now being rediscovered. Even more surprising are records of people from what we'd now call the Islamic world visiting or living in London. One account describes a scholar from the Middle East who may have come through France to study or consult with Christian counterparts. Though rare, these kinds of interactions weren't impossible. The exchange of knowledge, especially medical texts, was a bridge that brought different cultures together, even in a city as seemingly insular as medieval London. Another layer of diversity came from the Crusades. While these campaigns were largely violent and destructive, they also opened routes for travel and cultural exchange. Crusaders returning from the Holy Land sometimes brought back not just war trophies, but people, translators, artisans, even entire families. Some of them ended up in London, their names altered, their origins lost in translation, but their heritage quietly contributing to the life of the city. Slavery, too, must be acknowledged. Though not as formalized as the later transatlantic slave trade, records exist of enslaved people from Africa and the Middle East being brought into wealthy English households in London. Their presence was often erased from public memory, but we know from wills, letters, and inventories that they lived among the city's elite, often working behind the scenes with little recognition. Their stories are hard to trace, but they remind us that not all forms of movement were voluntary. We also find hints of diplomatic missions bringing diversity to London. In 1487, an envoy from Ethiopia is said to have visited England. While details are sparse, It's part of a pattern of African emissaries travelling to European courts, sometimes stopping in major ports like London. Whether to forge alliances, discuss trade, or explore religious ties, these journeys added yet another thread to London's multicultural fabric. In short, medieval London was far more diverse than its dusty history books often let on. Through trade, scholarship, diplomacy, war, and even forced migration, people from across the known world left their mark on the city. They were not always celebrated, and their stories are often hard to find. But archaeology, records, and fresh eyes on the past are slowly bringing them back into view. When we think of medieval London, the image often painted is of a mostly uniform society, English-speaking, Christian and white. But peel back the assumptions, and a more intricate mosaic comes into focus. London was a city in constant motion, absorbing ideas, customs, and people from across the known world. In this part of the story, we look at how cultural practices, language, food, and everyday life in medieval London reflected this rich tapestry of diversity. Let's start with language. While Middle English was the dominant tongue, Londoners would have heard a variety of other languages on the streets. Latin was spoken in the church and among scholars. French, thanks to the Norman influence, remained common among the elite. But go down to the docks or into the markets, and you might hear snippets of Arabic, Italian, or Norse. Trade brought sailors and merchants who spoke their native languages, and sometimes picked up bits of English. In a bustling port like London, multilingualism wasn't rare, it was necessary for doing business. Even legal records show that scribes sometimes struggled to translate foreign names or misheard accents, a sign of how regularly they interacted with people from abroad. Now think about what was on the dinner table. The cuisines of medieval Londoners weren't strictly local. Spices like cinnamon, cloves, pepper and saffron came from as far away as India, Persia or North Africa. These spices were expensive, but even households of modest means might stretch their budgets to include them in small quantities for special occasions. Sugar, a luxury item at the time, also made its way into English kitchens. Dried fruits like figs and dates imported through Mediterranean traders appeared in recipes. These were not merely flavours, they were evidence of deep global connections. The city's architecture and fashion also bore the marks of foreign influence. London's merchants and travellers brought home ideas about buildings and clothes from their visits abroad. For example, the popularity of certain hat styles, embroidery techniques or materials like silk can be traced to cultural exchanges. Wealthy Londoners often wore garments with fabrics woven in Italy or dyed, using methods from Islamic Spain. Sumptuary laws, rules about who could wear what, were sometimes a reaction to this growing cosmopolitanism, as English elites tried to control what they saw as foreign extravagance among the population. Then there's religion. While Christianity was dominant, traces of other faiths are present. There were Jewish communities in London from at least the Norman period, though they faced persecution and eventual expulsion in the 13th century. These communities played key roles in finance and scholarship. Some evidence also suggests that Muslims and people of other non-Christian faiths may have passed through or even lived in the city, especially as servants, sailors, or traders. Artifacts and burial records hint at quiet religious diversity, pockets of difference that coexisted within a largely Christian framework. Guilds, the powerful craft associations that controlled labour in medieval cities, provide yet another window into diversity. While some guilds had strict entry requirements, others were more flexible, especially when it came to skilled workers. Historical records mention individuals with foreign names, French, Dutch, even African, who practiced trades in London. A Moorish musician, a black trumpet player in Henry VII's court, and an Italian glassmaker are all recorded in various sources. These individuals weren't always treated equally, but they weren't invisible either. Cultural celebrations too showed the influence of diversity. Festivals sometimes included elements borrowed from other traditions. Pageants, plays, and religious processions could include costumes or narratives drawn from stories that had travelled long distances. Even the popular legends of the time, stories of knights, saints, and monsters, were shaped by global storytelling traditions. Crusaders returned from the Middle East, not just with battle scars, but with tales, artifacts, and perspectives that fed into the city's collective imagination. But perhaps the most powerful testament to medieval London's global reach is found in the cemeteries. Modern forensic studies of medieval graves have revealed skeletons whose chemical signatures suggest they were born far from Britain. Some from the Mediterranean, others from sub-Saharan Africa. Their bones tell silent stories of travel, migration, and life in a city far from their origins. They were buried in Christian cemeteries, sometimes with care and ritual, other times with signs of poverty or isolation. These graves are stark reminders that London's diversity wasn't just a matter of goods and ideas, it was about people. By the late Middle Ages, London's streets had become a subtle crossroads of faith, language, and identity. While the surface of the city may have appeared firmly English and Christian, digging just beneath that surface reveals a deeper story of religious minorities, foreign guilds, and intellectual exchange, hidden layers of diversity that shape the city's soul. One often overlooked group were the foreign clergy and scholars who moved through London. The church was not bound by national borders, and London's monasteries and churches welcomed friars, bishops, and scholars from all across Europe. Records from St. Paul's Cathedral and various abbeys show visitors from France, Italy, and the Low Countries. They often brought new ideas in philosophy, medicine, and theology. In fact, some of the earliest translations of Arabic scientific texts into Latin came through London via foreign clerics who had studied in Moorish Spain or the Middle East. These ideas, quietly carried across borders by pious men in robes, helped ignite intellectual changes that would one day fuel the Renaissance. London's diversity also thrived in its medical world. The city's hospitals, such as St. Bartholomew's, were melting pots of medical knowledge. Foreign-trained physicians from as far as Salerno and Paris were occasionally called upon to treat royalty and nobility. Apothecaries brought herbs and remedies from across the continent. Even surgical tools from Muslim Spain made their way into London's infirmaries. This international exchange wasn't just academic, it saved lives. Another fascinating thread lies in the lives of foreign artisans and engineers. Though most histories speak of kings and wars, the city's infrastructure, the stone bridges, Gothic windows, and towering spires, often relied on immigrant talent. Skilled masons from Normandy, German glassmakers, and Flemish sculptors contributed to London's skyline. These craftspeople left their mark, not only in stone and glass, but in how the city developed its distinct architectural character. Their guilds sometimes clashed with local ones, but they also trained local apprentices, blending their traditions with English techniques. Food and fashion also tell a story of cultural blending. Spices like saffron, cinnamon, and ginger were imported through Italian and Jewish trade routes and found their way into upper-class kitchens. Recipes from old manuscripts show clear Mediterranean influences in London cooking. Likewise, fashion was not purely English. Silks from Byzantium and brocades from Flanders were worn by nobles who had the money and the ambition to look continental. Tailors and cloth merchants often had foreign connections, and in some cases, foreign origins. London's legal system also bore the imprint of diversity. While common law was English, foreign merchants had their own legal customs. This led to the creation of special courts and arbitration systems where French, Italian, and German traders could resolve disputes without clashing with local practices. These courts, some of which were managed by mixed councils, offered rare examples of cross-cultural legal negotiation. It's a quiet but meaningful reminder that the law too adapted to diversity, even in medieval times. The city's prisons and criminal records offer another unexpected window into multicultural life. Foreigners were not immune to arrest or suspicion, yet records show that in many cases judges treated foreign defendants fairly, especially if they were part of established communities. Some petitions for mercy even mention cultural misunderstandings as reasons for leniency. This suggests that, while medieval London wasn't always tolerant, it wasn't universally hostile either. Children of mixed heritage were not uncommon. Intermarriage between locals and foreigners, especially among merchants and sailors, led to a generation of Londoners with dual identities. While these children often assimilated into English life, clues about their origins appear in wills, land records, and guild documents. A man might leave his estate to a son of a Lombard woman, or a baker might note that his daughter could speak both English and Dutch. These glimpses tell us that multiculturalism wasn't just a visitor, it became part of family histories. And then there's the language. Middle English, the language of Chaucer, wasn't immune to foreign influence. French, Latin, Dutch, and even Arabic loanwords filtered into the dialect of Londoners. Merchant slangs and legal jargon absorbed phrases from across Europe. Even the structure of contracts and charters began to reflect foreign models. Language became a bridge, allowing people of different backgrounds to work, worship, and live side by side, even if they couldn't always speak perfectly to one another.